Can everybody hear me? Hi. Hi, everybody. Uh, hello. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate the support and being here to educate yourselves. I just really appreciate it. I know pretty much all of you, but I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. My name's Jace. My pronouns are they them. I've been in attendance of Ahava for uh, just shy of 4 years now. I, found the Ahava booth at Pride back in 2018 and showed up a couple weeks later and haven't gone back. And as of 8 months ago, I founded our queer youth group, Queering Spirituality. My goal with that was to, create a safe space and an open and affirming space for queer, like teens, young adults, to just be able to exist as themselves in an environment where maybe they're not getting that at home or, out at school, or gives them a chance to, explore the intersections of, spirituality, gender, sexuality, all of that. Today's presentation is called Beyond Binary, an exploration of gender identity and expression. And the reason I wanted to bring this presentation to Ahava was to educate people and, especially with gender identity. I think it's something that, in the last couple of years, we've really seen a big movement in non-binary genders and, more affirming experiences of gender in young people, like old and young people, people of all ages. A lot of people are sort of, speculating or thinking that, it's this new phenomenon. And, there's some, terminology that's, very new, but, a lot of this, these complex ideas about gender aren't as new as we think they are. So we're going to explore some of those today. Next slide, please. So objectives of today's workshop, we're gonna understand the differences between sex, gender identity, and gender expression. Gonna identify some basic terminology regarding gender. We're gonna explore some non-Western gender identities. We're gonna discover why our understanding of gender is the way that it is today. And we're gonna learn some ways to be a positive and supportive ally. So those are sort of the goals of this workshop today. Next slide, please. So just some sort of like ground rules that I just sort of like to establish with these presentations that I like to do. So be curious. Feel free to ask questions all throughout the workshop. I'm an open book. I want people to be curious and learn. If you've got a really in-depth question, feel free to hang on to that, and you can talk to me after the workshop or at some other point as well, just so we can keep our time all tight and such. Be respectful, so respect and honor experiences that differ from your own understanding of gender. There's a lot of new things, and it's okay to not understand at first, but it's just be open to that, and be patient. The world of gender is far vaster than an hour-long workshop can encompass. And a similar note on that, I am just one singular voice. I am a queer white person in Kentucky. And, I definitely don't speak on behalf of, all of these cultures. We're all trans people, but, these are my perspectives and, my interpretations of some knowledge. So next slide, please. Just a quick disclaimer. On some like outdated terms that might pop up. So there's a couple of terms that, we've sort of started to, in our Western ideas of gender, have sort of like deemed like outdated or offensive. Some of those terms are still used in some cultures, internationally, or were used. There's also some stuff that are just sort of like a historical, indicator that I might mention, but they're not necessarily appropriate terms to use. So I might, they might come up every once in a while. If they do, I'll note those as, like, it's not necessarily appropriate to use that today, but this is how it was then, and so on. So just a quick, note on that. Other than that, let's jump into it. So next slide, please. So I wanted to start this off just sort of at like have this like sort of open discussion about gender, because I think there's sort of a central idea that I think a lot of us have about gender, but all of our all the finite details of it vary a lot. So I'm curious, and it can be an open discussion. You can shout it out or whatever. What is your understanding of gender, and what do you think of when you hear the word gender? Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, the or is something that I think a lot of us heard. It's either or. It's not. It's never both. It's never a mix. Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, yeah.
I think in American culture, we have always combined gender and sex, as in male female,
Hmm.
whereas sex is more of the biological indicator,
Hmm.
where gender is more of the internal, how you feel about yourself, and then present that outward.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like, the conflation of, sex and gender, that's a really big part of especially, American and Western culture for sure. Hope, yes. Yeah. Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And that's sort of like, my similar to my idea of gender, it's a lot of people picture it sort of on this like linear line. And there's a lot more nuance to it, like with identity, with expression, with, sex assigned at birth. There's a lot of, deviation and it's sort of a three-dimensional shape rather than a line. Yes, Mike.
Because of my hearing, I missed some of what Hope said.
Yeah.
Could you restate it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Hope was saying that they sort of view gender, rather than sort of a line from male to female or like that sort of like goes back and forth on the spectrum. It's a little bit broader, more of like a color palette where it's a lot more complex and it sort of has specific differences in different areas. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? Cool. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, Mike.
When I was growing up, um, I started hearing the word gender being used in school and in other news and things like that. And it was confusing because no one defined it.
Hmm.
So, you learn to create your own definitions out of inference. Well,
Hmm.
I hear it used here and I hear it used there, so maybe it means this.
Right.
And I came to think of it as kind of an almost like a euphemism because, to say, you know, if if you saw a person and from their outward appearance, from their clothing, from their hairstyle, from their body shape,
Hmm.
and this would happen all the time, and people would say, "Is that a girl or a boy?"
Hmm.
That was just a real common thing,
Hmm.
you know. And then if you wanted to form that into a question, I never felt comfortable saying, "What is your sex?"
Right.
Something about that that just seemed crude to me,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, because it not only implied biology and all that, but it was coming real close to saying, "How do you like to copulate?" You know, and
Right.
I didn't like
Right.
that. I didn't think it was a real good
Hmm.
feeling to bring into a
Yeah.
polite conversation with people.
Yeah.
And then I latched on to, oh, gender,
Hmm.
So that's what I mean when I say it's euphemistic,
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
started saying, like, I wonder what gender that person
Yeah.
is,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
and things like that. So it sort of has a euphemistic quality for me. But the other context in which I learned to use the word, and this is kind of funny, but in the world of electricity and electronics,
Hmm.
devices like plugs and
Hmm.
jacks are classified according to gender,
Hmm.
you know. So a plug is considered male gender
Hmm.
in electronic technology,
Hmm.
and a jack, which is a hole, is considered female gender.
Hmm.
And in rock and roll music, you can go down to the music store and you can buy chords that are called gender benders.
Hmm.
a change from one gender to
Yeah.
another. So there's a whole implication of, to be a little crude about it, how do things fit together?
Right.
How do the parts fit together?
Absolutely.
It's kind of a background thing,
Hmm.
but it's kind of crude to bring that up in a discussion with another person.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, it's, there's a lot of, and that's something that, I think, so many of us have grown up, conflating, sex and gender, or, like making it, about a person's biology versus, their own understanding or their expression of what their gender is. And, it's really the whole thing about the electricity, it's really interesting how much of our society, no matter, how much we try to deter from it, so many things in our everyday world are gendered without, like, unnecessarily. There's, in sewing, there, with, I believe, like snaps, like for like a shirt or something. It's same thing. There's a male and a female part, and it's sort of that same sort of like construct of, like, it being about biological sex. And it's really interesting. We're starting to, slowly like pull away from some of those, but that's what a lot of us know about gender. So yeah, awesome, cool. Well, thank you for all of those thoughts. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's always interesting, just to hear everybody's different perspectives on gender, because they're all, there's so much overlap, but they're still all very different, which I really love. So, next slide, please. Did you want to say? Yeah. Yeah. That is, yeah, that gendering brownies. That's a new one. I have not heard that, but yeah, that's, and at that point it feels almost like ridiculous, like, with, how far people will go with it sometimes. But it's just so infused into our culture. So yeah, so next we're going to go over some, basic terminology, that sort of, dives more into, what we were talking about. So, and, most of these are, not brand new, but like newer. So we have the term cisgender, which refers to someone whose gender identity aligns with one associated with their sex assigned at birth. So this is, majority of the population, what most of us know. So somebody is assigned female at birth, based on their sex organs, their genitalia, and they grow up and identify as a woman, and so that person would be cisgender. Transgender is somebody whose gender identity differs from that associated with their sex assigned at birth. So it could be somebody who was assigned male at birth, and then like after, it could be, early on in life or later in life, they realize that um, they aren't actually a man, that they're a woman. And that's a pretty simple definition of transgender, and it's representative of a lot of broad experiences of transness. And then non-binary is an umbrella term for gender identities that don't fit strictly in the binary systems of man and woman or male and female. So it's a term on its own, and it's an umbrella term. So some people just identify as non-binary, and then there's terms that sort of fall under the umbrella of non-binary. So gender identities that differ from just man and woman. And like I said earlier, everybody's different. Everybody's experiences with gender are very different. So it's a pretty it's a broad yet also narrow definition, if that makes sense. Next slide, please. So then, we're going to jump into a couple more terms. So transitioning just refers to the process of taking steps to affirm one's gender. This can be physically, medically, and or socially. It varies in degree. And something that I'd like to note too is, like, it doesn't always necessarily refer to trans people that transition. I think, our sort of idea of of people transitioning is, somebody taking hormones, going through surgeries, changing their name. But it could also be, like somebody getting gender affirming surgeries, to like make, to be happier in their body. So, somebody who's cisgender could even have, gender affirming, surgeries and such. So, and, similar to, experiences of gender, Transitioning is very different for everybody. It's not like a start to finish kind of process. Some people decide to take hormones, some people don't. Some people choose to get gender affirming surgery, some people don't. Yeah, so, it's another thing that, just varies person to person. AFAB is sort of like a short term that was sort of coined a couple of years ago. Just means assigned female at birth. So, instead of saying like biological female or something like that, somebody that is assigned female at birth. Typically, and another similar one is AMAB, assigned male at birth. And these terms, you don't necessarily see somebody identifying with necessarily. They're just sort of terms that they will use to like say if they're talking about themselves in a more personal, private way about their experiences. And then intersex is an individual with ambiguous sex characteristics. So this, is somebody that, may have had, just a singular X chromosome, might have had an XXY chromosome combination, and, when they were born had ambiguous sex characteristics, ambiguous genitalia. So, it could mean that they have, different kind of, experiences with their body. It could mean that, their understanding of their gender is a little bit not skewed. I almost said skewed, but that's not the correct word. It's a little more, it's more complex because, they didn't have the sort of cookie cutter understanding of gender that we're all sort of like handed when we're born. The previous term that was used for intersex was hermaphrodite, which is a lot more known. It's pretty out of date because it was used sort of in an offensive tone. So intersex was coined more recently to sort of replace that. Next slide, please. So then, we've talked a lot about, gender, expression, sex. So these are just some quick sort of like explanations of each to sort of like show separations of them. So we have sex, so somebody that was assigned, what you were assigned at birth, based on your sex organs or genitalia, so this could be male, female, intersex. Gender identity is one's own personal sense of their gender, so, it can be, an infinite number of things, so man, woman, non-binary, genderqueer, many, many other terms, and, if we had 6 hours, we could maybe go through all of them, but I want to respect your all's time. And then gender expression. Somebody's gender identity can still vary a little bit from their gender expression. So we have people that might be a man or be a masculine person, like a trans man or a cis man, but they might express themselves in a feminine way. They might wear nail polish. They might So that's sort of where the difference between identity and expression comes. So yeah, so all three of these, overlap and relate to each other, but they're all very distinctly different. Yeah, so that's just sort of an explanation on all of that. Any questions so far? I don't want to go too fast. Cool. Next slide, please. So just real quick before we get into some of our more interesting international genders. This is just a cool graph that I like to show when we talk about gender and gender identity, because a lot of people like to talk about how it's new and like, oh, there's so many trans people now, we didn't have them when I was younger, and this and that, and it's just not quite true. So this graph sort of shows the history of left-handedness in the United States. So before we understood that left-handedness was just simply a different trait than right-handedness, it was just a little less common. People thought that there was something physically or mentally wrong with people who were left-handed. So once they realized that it's just like a different trait or a different variation in somebody's brain chemistry, there was an increase and an uptick in left-handedness. And it wasn't because people were deciding to be left-handed. It was simply because they weren't being ridiculed or punished for trying to write with their left hand. So a very similar idea can be applied to, transness and, understanding of gender. Is, we're now reaching a point in our society that we're being open now and affirming to a lot of people, and that's allowed people to be more open about themselves. So, yeah, it's just a fun little graphic I like to share. So now that we've covered a couple of the basics, let's dive into some like rich histories of gender diversity around the world. Next slide, please. So just some quick common themes that we see in some of these identities, across the world. A lot of these individuals, who had third or other genders in their cultures, a lot of them are viewed as elders or wisdom keepers. A lot of them, their identity is connected to their spirituality. They were sometimes considered somebody who had higher spiritual enlightenment. So they were definitely, sort of like considered higher within, within their tribes and groups and cultures. There's, and these are just some other interesting things that I found, in my research. There's a lot of terms and, sort of like, spaces for AMAB individuals to, like explore like femininity or, present as a woman or, do like socially accepted things as a woman, and not as many for AFAB individuals, which I found very interesting. And what sort of plays into that is my next bullet point, which is patriarchal systems and gender roles still existed in many of these societies. So even if they had a third, fourth, fifth, or more gender term, they didn't always, they still had those sort of ideas that, men were sort of like the caretakers and, were hunters or, doing very specific roles where women were doing different roles. And, it didn't necessarily mean that they, those systems still existed, but they, so sorry, lost my train of thought for a sec. It doesn't mean that they weren't allowed to, explore those different societal roles, but they still sort of existed like that. And some of the terms are equitable to being trans. Some of them are completely, separate term on their own. Some of them, like identify as, a different gender than they were assigned at birth. Some of them don't. It's all, very, like I said, it's all vastly different. Next slide, please. So why don't we know about all of these, all this rich history of gender and, gender diversity? The biggest reasons behind it are colonialism, and, Christianity and, whitewashing of history. So, a lot of these communities, they had, these rich cultures and practices that vary differently from Christianity. As European settlers came into, the United States, into Africa, into India, all places around the world, they saw, these individuals that didn't look like them, who didn't practice the same thing that they did, who were doing things that, just differed from their understanding of everything, including gender. And, a lot of them were appalled by it. And, so they did everything that they could to bury that and to, convert them to Christianity. And, that sort of led to a lot of places, now Christianity being sort of like the primary, religion and practice in a lot of these places. And a lot of these, older understandings of their culture, some of them had died out completely. Luckily, a lot of them have, been preserved by, people that have like clung on and really like, fought for their own culture. But yeah, that's sort of, where, or not where, why, a lot of us don't know about it because, we just weren't being taught it because, a lot of people just didn't know about it. So let's get into some cool identities. So next slide, please. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Two-Spirit. So this is an umbrella term for Native American or indigenous communities to refer to complex understandings and experiences of gender and identity. It's an umbrella term. It's one that's, that was coined, fairly recently in the last about 30 years or so. It was coined in 1990. So this is an umbrella term for a vast, vast world of gender terms and identities that Native American tribes would use for gender identities. It's not interchangeable with sexuality. Some people sometimes confuse it with that. It's estimated that over 150 pre-colonial tribes acknowledged a third or other gender. So this was something that, a lot of, Native American tribes had some kind of term for. And, like I said, all of them had different languages and experiences, so they're all completely different. And we're going to cover like two of them. And, they often serve specific roles in their tribes. So it could be, serving a specific role in a, spiritual ceremony. It could mean they had a specific title or that they had to do specific tasks for their tribe. Some of them were referred to as balance keepers because they were sort of seen as people that, that had both a male and female spirit in their terms. So if you'll go to the next slide, I have a video that I'm going to show of a two-spirit person explaining a little bit more about like the history of the term two-spirit and like sort of where it comes from and such. So yeah, that video really gives a great like briefing history of Native American gender and the journey that they've had with going from this rich understanding of gender to being colonized and losing a lot of it, and we're seeing a wave of acceptance again, and it's a really beautiful thing. So next slide, please. So yeah, as that individual mentioned, it's something that has been practiced in tribes for many years before Two-Spirit was termed, or was coined. Next slide, please. And they even mentioned this individual that that I was going to talk about, Wiwa. So they were part of the Zuni tribe, which is modern-day New Mexico. So the term that this tribe uses for AMAB individuals is lamana. It refers to people who take on social and ceremonial roles of women in the tribe. So Wiwa was a potter, a weaver, a hunter, and a spiritual leader, and as they mentioned in the video, became a representative of the Zuni tribe and spoke to President Grover Cleveland about Native American rights. Next slide, please. And then just another one that I wanted to mention before we move on to another country are terms from the Ojibwe tribe. So they have terms for both AFAB and AMAB individuals. So there's Ikwikazo and Ininikazo. Ikwikazo refers to one who endeavors to be like a woman, and vice versa for Ininikazo, one who endeavors to be like a man. They often assumed roles based on spiritual dreams or visions, and there's also literature that confirms that they were actually allowed to marry or have spouses of their same gender or their same sex. And that was way back in the day. So next slide, please. So now we're jumping into India and Southern Asia. So Hijra is a nationally recognized third gender in India. It typically refers to somebody who is assigned male at birth, who presents themselves with feminine characteristics and roles. Some of them are trans women, some of them just identify in a feminine way. It heavily ties to Hinduist practices, and there's a lot of gender fluidity in the Hindu religion that is really cool. It was previously used to describe eunuchs, so people that willingly castrated themselves. Some Hijras still do this practice, but it's not a universal principle. And it's still something that's very taboo and discriminatory in India. It is a legal gender, but there's the communities that exist are pretty underground and still, pretty tight-knit because of this. Next slide, please. So similar to Native American cultures, Hijras were accepted as spiritual leaders. So they were expected to perform dances, songs, and blessings at births and weddings at Hindu practices. To many Hindus, a Hidra's blessings of a baby will confer fertility, prosperity, and a long life on the child. 1 to 2 days after a marriage ceremony, Hijras were to perform to bless the couple for fertility. So they're definitely, very similar to two-spirit identities. Individuals that, were expected to, have a higher spiritual understanding of gender. Next slide, please. Now we're jumping into Hawaii. So their term for gender diversity is mahu. It literally translates to in the middle. So it's for Native Hawaiian and Tahitian cultures. It typically refers to, again, AMAB individuals who present femininely. Some of them are trans women, some of them are not. And once again, they've been viewed as elders who've passed on genealogy and traditions, especially hula dance. A lot of modern people who are identify as Mahu are hula teachers and pass that tradition on specifically. And they typically, in ancient practices, spiritual practices, they perform the roles of goddesses in ceremonies. And these were typically ceremonies that um, cisgender women were not welcome to. So, AMAB men or Mahu individuals would dress as these female goddesses instead when cisgender women were not allowed there. Next slide, please. So I've got another video. This is from a documentary called A Place in the Middle. It's a fantastic documentary. It's less than 30 minutes. It's on YouTube, and I have a link at the very end of this presentation if you ever would like to check it out. But this is a short clip from it. This follows the journey of a modern Mahu individual who is older. She's in her, I believe, 40s or 50s. And then a child who also identifies as Mahu, who's learning to explore that culture more. So yeah, let's watch this video as well. Awesome. Yeah, that I highly recommend watching that documentary because it's just an incredible, it's heartbreaking to see how much, it has affected, so many cultures, colonialism and all of this. But it's a beautiful statement on how resilient all of these cultures have been through all of that. And it's beautiful to see how much, has still stayed, 200 years later, as she mentioned. Next slide, please. Just a couple other, non-Western identities I wanted to, mention just for fun. So, Bernatia refers to Albanian AFAB individuals who take an oath of virginity and live their lives as men. This practice has sort of died out as women have gained more rights in Albania, but there are still, I think it's estimated, there's fewer than 30 Bernatia who still exist today. Sister girls and brother boys are Aboriginal Australian terms for gender diverse individuals. So they're specific terms, for, trans people, but also people who just, experience their gender in a, in a unique way. And they're specific to the Aboriginal tribes of Australia. Kalabai, Kalalai, and Bisu are Indonesian terms. These were sort of their three terms for trans and gender diverse people. Bisu was sort of their third gender that was, sort of a non-binary similar term. And they served ritual roles and sometimes were equated with priests. So again, that sort of like spiritual connection again. Mushe is a third gender of Mexico, and it refers to AMAV individuals who present feminine and sometimes take on societal roles of women. It is sometimes also used to refer to gay men, but typically it's more so referring to gender identities. Next slide, please. Here I have, we're running a little bit long on time, so I have this at the end, but this is a really great resource that, is where I started to learn, some of the vast diversity of gender. There's this map on PBS's website that, it literally looks like a Google map, and it's, the entire globe, and it's got little markers where there's been, some kind of occurrence or where there was a culture where there was an understanding of a third gender. And there's, I'd say, maybe 3 or 4 dozen, markers on that map. There are so many different ways of, different understandings of gender that, have just, just not been, just have disappeared, in the last, several hundred years because of colonialism. Next slide, please. So where we stand today, I just sort of, I wanted to share this at the end, some pictures from some of these cultures that we've talked about to sort of, show that, despite all of this, we talked a lot about, negativity with, with colonialism and with sort of this erasure of culture. But these practices are still alive and thriving today in a lot of communities, and they're really, being uplifted, especially in the last, 5, 10 years. They've really begun to have new life again, and embrace these cultures that they were told were wrong for a very long time. So we're definitely reaching a point of, understanding again, and yeah, so that's sort of, where we stand today. Next slide, please. Just to sort of wrap it up, I just, wrote down some, quick, like ally tips. So, one of the biggest things is to listen. When you're, talking to somebody who, has a, diverse gender experience, who's trans, whatever it might be, or, and, this could be applied to, anybody that has any kind of, experiences that differs from yours. Listen, talk to those within the community, hear what they have to say about their experiences, and know that they're all different. Educate yourself, read literature about gender diversity, be open to learning new things, and understand that terms and language are constantly evolving. Pronouns, everybody uses them, even if you don't. Not all of us, or not a lot of us, think about it. We just sort of use them without thinking about them. But we've all got them. So some things to consider to help support other communities is to wear a pronoun button, which we will be making after this workshop if you would like to make one for yourself, and putting them in your email signature, social media profiles, ways that sort of show what that does is it helps people not assume gender identity of somebody just based on their appearance. It also helps trans and gender diverse people know that, if somebody has pronouns in their bio, it helps us immediately think, oh, that person sort of understands gender a little bit more than somebody else. And, helps us know that we have an ally in that person. Ask questions. If you're unsure about something, it's okay to ask. We don't expect everybody to learn everything overnight. And even this workshop's an hour. I don't expect you to all to remember every single detail, because it's a lot of information. And when we spend our entire lives understanding gender a certain way, it takes a long time to unlearn some of that. And that's okay. It's okay to ask questions and still be unsure. Yeah, and remember that every trans and gender diverse person is different. Everybody's experiences contrast vastly, and everybody has different comfort levels in what they can talk about. So just keep all of that in mind. And yeah, that's next slide. That's pretty much all I have. So now I'm gonna open the floor up for questions. So if anybody has any questions about anything, I'm more than happy to answer. Yeah, any questions or thoughts? Yeah, yeah.
It's not a question, but it's a story from years ago.
Yeah.
Back in the day, I was a dental hygienist, and I was talking to this patient and filling out a form,
Mhm.
Can you talk a little louder? I don't hear well either. Mike and I don't hear well.
Oh, yeah, yeah. We have a microphone. Here, I'll give you the mic.
Oh, there, good job. Okay, years ago, back in the day, I was a dental hygienist, and I had this patient, and I was filling out a form, okay, this and your address, and let's see, you're a male, and he said, well, no, actually, I'm not. And I think I stared at him for a full minute, and I said, okay, what do you consider yourself? And he said, well, and I know he meant hermaphrodite, but he said, I'm an Aphrodite.
I mean, some people consider trans people quite godlike, so that's that's a really fun story. I love that. Yeah, that's a very fun story. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, yeah, it's and that that's it. You just got to ask where people are at, and sometimes they'll give you a clear answer. Sometimes they'll tell you that you're a Greek god, and so. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions or thoughts or anything? Cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't have a question, but I'm really grateful for the history that you shared, because I didn't realize
Yeah.
So it's really interesting.
Mhm.
I find it very interesting. So I'm
Yeah.
really, really grateful that you take this time to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, this is something that I'm very passionate about. I love, you know, learning about people's understanding of gender and teaching people about, diversity of gender. It's one of my passions, and I really love, sharing this with you all. And I'm very glad that, I'm able to do this, that I have the platform to do this. That Ahava's, able to offer this to us. Um, and yeah, so yeah, thank you. And I'll end by saying, thank you all for being here and being open to learning about all of this. Yeah, Mike.
On that last point,
Yeah.
Jace, just to take you up on your very welcome offer. I mean, can we just email you or text you or something to say, hey, Jace, I ran into something. I don't quite have, what does it mean to you? Can you point me in a direction to help me understand this better?
Mhm.
So if you could share something that you're comfortable with, like your
Yeah,
email address or something,
absolutely.
much appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be more than happy to share my email with everybody. If you ever have any questions or concerns, I'm here almost every Sunday, so you're always more than welcome to pull me aside if you ever got a question of any kind. But yeah, if you've ever got questions about hey, is this okay, or I came across this situation, or I'm looking for a resource on this, I'm definitely not a complete encyclopedia, but I can at least point you in the right direction. So. And if you go to the next slide, I do have some of the stuff that I used in this video today, and some other resources just from the identities I had. If you want to take a picture of any of it, feel free. And I'm also welcome to, or more than happy to send any of these to you as well. So um, yeah, with that, that kind of wraps up our workshop. So now so we're wrapped up with this part, but you're more than welcome to stay afterwards to either chat or we'll also be in the community room making pronoun buttons. So once again, thank you all for being here, and I really appreciate your all's time. So thank you.